The morning heat already pressed down on Dusktown Reserve Base by 0600 hours. Beth wiped her hands on a rag that used to be white. The familiar weight of her wrench balanced perfectly in her palm. 5 years she'd been here, 5 years of proving herself one bolt at a time in a world that still saw coveralls and assumed support staff. The M2 Bradley squatted in Bay 3 like a sleeping giant, its hull gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. Beth crouched beneath the side panel, her trained eye catching what the computer diagnostics had missed, a subtle vibration in the pressure sink manifold that would spell disaster at the wrong moment. "Morning sunshine," came a voice dripping with mock authority. Lieutenant Commander Ray Hutchinson strode into the bay like he owned not just the space, but everyone in it. Tall, broad-shouldered, with insignia that caught the light just right, Ray had perfected the art of making his presence known. Behind him trailed Corporal Danny Martinez, already smirking like he was in on some private joke. Jonas Webb, the maintenance supervisor, scurried over with his ever-present clipboard. At 52, Jonas had mastered the delicate dance of military. Bureaucracy, keep the brass happy, keep the paperwork clean, keep your head down. Ray's eyes swept the hangar and landed on Beth. "You've got civilians doing inspection work now?" His voice carried that particular edge reserved for people he considered beneath notice. "I asked for someone qualified. Didn't realize we were outsourcing to the motor pool." Beth didn't look up. She'd learned long ago that visibility often cost more than it offered. She finished adjusting the torque setting, her movements deliberate and precise. Each tool was an extension of herself, speaking a language she'd been fluent in since she was 17, learning at her father's side. "She's on the diagnostic schedule, sir," Jonas offered weakly. "Routine workup before the readiness inspection." Ray cocked his head with false curiosity. "Diagnostics? That's cute. What's her name again?" The silence stretched like a held breath. Not Jonas, not Danny, not even Marcus. The young mechanic sorting parts nearby offered an answer. Beth brushed a strand of dust-matted hair from her cheek. "There's a slight torque imbalance in the pressure sink manifold," she said quietly, not turning around. "I logged it this morning. Might want to run a real-time reading at incline load. It won't show up in static testing." Ray raised an eyebrow, as if she'd just claimed to speak Martian. "You found a problem the onboard systems didn't?" "Not a problem," Beth said, still calm. "A drift. Happens just before the R6 patch triggers its bypass. You won't notice it until slope angle passes. 10 degrees per second lateral." Danny chuckled. "Sounds like someone's been reading repair forums again." Beth met his eyes briefly, then looked away. She'd had this conversation before, in different hangars with different men who wore their dismissal like armor. Ray tilted, his head studying her like a puzzle he was already bored of solving. "So let me get this straight. You, standing there in oil-stained coveralls, think you know more about this Bradley's response system than the R6 firmware?" "I'm saying the R6 masks the drift, doesn't stop it. And if you're pulling throttle uphill with a full squad inside, you'll feel it." Danny barked out a laugh. "Let's hope she's not driving when it happens." Jonas laughed too, but it sounded forced, brittle. "All right, let's just move along. Ray, I'll have Danny handle the checklist from here. Beth, you're good to move on to the battery rack." That was it. Not a correction, not a defense. Just a smooth dismissal, practiced and efficient. Beth picked up her wrench. No one made eye contact. Marcus opened his mouth like he might say something, then thought better of it and returned to his parts inventory. Ray clapped Danny on the back. "Glad we've got actual techs on this now. Hate to see $1 million ride go belly up because someone wanted to play mechanic." Beth stepped back from the Bradley. The wrench in her hand felt heavier now, not with weight, but with the familiar ache of being right in a world that didn't want to listen. She walked past the diagnostic bench, past the knowing looks and careful silences toward the corner where her personal kit waited. Outside, a hawk circled lazily above the communications tower, riding thermals that rose from the sun-baked tarmac. Beth didn't head for the break room like she usually did. Instead, she made her way to the back corner of the garage where an old locker stood in the shadow of a broken light fixture. The metal door squealed as she opened it, revealing her personal toolkit, the one she'd brought from civilian life, when her name still meant something in engineering circles. These weren't standard-issue tools. Every wrench was titanium alloy. Every gauge calibrated to tolerances that would make a Swiss watchmaker weep. They'd cost more than her last 3 paychecks combined, but they were hers. She'd earned them the hard way. At the bottom of the case lay a folded sheet of paper, yellowed at the edges. Beth unfolded it carefully, a hand-sketched diagram of a suspension rig, early Bradley prototype, drawn from memory after one of her father's field visits. She'd been 17 when they'd made it together, tracing axis lines and labeling parts while he explained the physics of keeping 30 tons of steel stable on uncertain ground. The pressure sink imbalance she'd identified wasn't new. She'd seen it before, years ago, in a different life when her recommendations carried weight and her solutions were implemented instead of ignored. She'd built a fix then, not a software Band-Aid like the R6, but a mechanical solution that actually addressed the root cause. Her old team had dismissed it as too analog, too expensive to retrofit, so she'd built it anyway, on her own time, with her own materials. When the lawsuit came and the non-disclosure agreements buried her name under layers of legal concrete, she'd packed her kit and her silence and started over. That evening, long after the others had gone home, Beth sat at her workbench with the original diagram spread before her and a clean napkin under her elbow. Her pencil moved with practiced precision, sketching curves and calculating load ratios she could work out in her sleep. Marcus wandered in, carrying a stack of air filters. He paused when he saw her working, curiosity overcoming caution. "You draw that from memory?" he asked, nodding at the napkin. Beth didn't look up. "It's just a layout." "Looks more like a correction." She kept sketching. "Just an idea." "You ever think about submitting something like that? Like, officially?" Beth's pencil stopped moving. "I've submitted enough things for a lifetime." Marcus stepped closer, studying the clean lines and precise annotations. "That torque drift thing from this morning, how'd you know?" She looked up at him then, seeing something in his expression she recognized. The hunger to understand, to learn, to get better at something that mattered. "I heard it," she said simply. "Heard it? It's not a sound the system flags. It's a rhythm. You hear it just before the lateral roll correction kicks in." Marcus looked genuinely impressed. "I didn't even know that was possible." Beth finally met his eyes. "Most people don't listen long enough." That night, when the garage was dark except for the exit signs and the soft glow of one workstation lamp, Beth opened the storage cabinet and pulled down an old test bracket. She cleaned it carefully, bolted it to her table, and began assembling the override system piece by piece. She didn't need diagrams. Her hands moved with muscle memory, each component clicking into place like a secret being remembered. The tension, spring, the throttle diverter, the modified sync loop, parts she'd machined and calibrated and adjusted until they sang in perfect harmony. She finished just past midnight. The override module sat on her table, no bigger than a lunchbox, connected to the bracket with dampened clamps and a bypass controller she'd rebuilt from scrap components. It wasn't pretty, but it would work. Beth tested the tension once. It held. She tested it again. Still smooth. She didn't write her name on it. She didn't need to. Some tools weren't for sharing, some truths weren't for telling, not until someone needed them badly enough to listen. The first sign came 3 days later, halfway up the east training slope. Ray had driven that incline dozens of times, but this time the Bradley's throttle hesitated, just for a heartbeat, but long enough to send ripples through the onboard monitoring system. Then came the drift. It was subtle, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. An uneven lateral response when the treads adjusted to off-camber terrain. The vehicle corrected itself, but not before the rear end shifted just wide enough to knock 2 of the gunners sideways in their seats. Back in the garage, Danny shrugged off the incident report like lint from his sleeve. "Elevation distortion," he said, keying in another R6 override patch. "Dry grit buildup. Happens. Every time the weather swings more than 10 degrees. Ray didn't look convinced, but he let it pass. Protocol was protocol, and Danny ran diagnostics like a man who believed any problem that could be solved with a software patch wasn't really a problem at all. By midday, the Bradley had lost nearly a third of its slope stability during test runs. The left side response lagged by almost 2 seconds on incline, not enough to matter on flat terrain, but Ray's unit wasn't heading for flat ground. Beth watched from her corner workstation as Jonas paced the garage floor, checklist crumpled in one sweaty palm. The rehearsal operation was scheduled for the end of the week, and if Ray's unit missed that window, Command would start asking questions Jonas couldn't answer. "They just need to recalibrate," he muttered under his breath, more to convince himself than anyone else. "This isn't a failure. This is noise." The man who walked into the garage that afternoon moved like he owned more than just the room. He owned the problems in it. Lean, maybe mid-40s, in a gray Pentagon contractor jacket with a plain black duffel slung over one shoulder. No name tag, no visible rank. He didn't need them. He walked straight to Jonas, who straightened like a schoolboy called to the principal's office. "Can I help you, sir?" The man pulled out a tablet and tapped something quickly. "Name's Tanner. I'm here on request from Command Logistics, vehicle integrity assessments tied to readiness failures." "Bradley number 427, assigned to Lieutenant Commander Hutchinson." Jonas blanched. "It's not a failure, sir, just some drift we're already addressing." Tanner didn't reply. He handed Jonas a datasheet that made the supervisor's face go pale. "This one's been patched 6 times in 2 weeks. R6 firmware is designed to mask torque instability, not correct it. That's a problem." "We've got our best people on it." "Do you?" Tanner asked without raising his voice. "Because your logs say otherwise." He moved past Jonas and walked to the main diagnostic terminal. A key drive slid into the port and the overhead display filled with maintenance records going back months. Tanner's eyes scanned the data with the systematic efficiency of someone who'd done this before. When he paused, it was only for a moment. "Who's Beth?" The garage went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of people working, but the tense silence of people watching something dangerous unfold. "That would be me," Beth said from across the room. She set down her tool and wiped her hands on a clean rag, meeting his gaze steadily. Tanner studied her for a long moment. "Your name's in the modification archive for the original torque sync pathway. This was your design?" "I worked on sync stabilization once," she said carefully. "A long time ago." "That override method you flagged in the logs? Why didn't you recommend it?" Beth looked at the screen, then back at him. "Nobody asked." The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable. Marcus glanced between them, barely breathing. Jonas shifted his weight from foot to foot. Danny suddenly found his clipboard fascinating. Tanner lowered his voice just enough. "I've seen this fault before. It doesn't show in static runs, and the R6 hides it just long enough to fail under pressure." Beth held his gaze. "Then you know what happens next." "Yeah," he said quietly. "I do?" The weight of that admission settled over the room like dust. Marcus felt it, even if he didn't understand it. Jonas felt it, and tried to dismiss it. Danny felt it, and started calculating how to distance himself from the problem. Tanner stepped back, still watching Beth. "Why are you here?" She returned to her work, her voice matter-of-fact. "Because nobody reads the old files." Danny tried to cut in, his voice too loud in the quiet space. "We've got it under control, sir. She's not even cleared for—" Tanner raised a hand, and Danny's words died in his throat. "Save it. I know what I'm looking at." Jonas cleared his throat, grasping for control of a situation that had already slipped through his fingers. "Sir, with all respect, we're addressing the drift. It's not a mechanical issue. It's localized atmospheric distortion affecting the sensor arrays." Tanner didn't even blink. "The vehicle's torque response fails at incline angles above 10 degrees per second. That's not weather. That's a system failing exactly as predicted in the original design documents." He turned back to Beth. "You wrote those, didn't you?" Beth didn't answer. She didn't need to. Tanner nodded once, looked around the room like a man surveying a landscape before deciding where to dig, then left without another word. The garage didn't breathe for a long time. Jonas stood motionless, clipboard hanging limp in his grip. Danny avoided eye contact with everyone, suddenly busy with meaningless tasks. Ray hadn't even returned yet, but the air was already heavier, the walls closer, the silence louder. Marcus approached Beth's workstation slowly. "You okay?" Beth looked at the napkin beside her workbench, still marked with the previous night's calculations. "Not yet," she said quietly, "but close." The bay door slammed shut behind Jonas, the sound echoing too loud in the suddenly empty garage. He stood just inside, clipboard limp in one hand, sweat staining the collar of his uniform. "Should." Beth didn't move from her workbench. She'd known he would come, just not when. His footsteps scraped across the concrete as he stopped a few feet from her station. "They're going to ground the unit," he said, voice tight with barely controlled panic. "If that Bradley fails the next test, Ray's team won't deploy, and if that happens, Command is going to pull our readiness rating, and I'm going to have to answer for that." Beth waited. He wasn't done. "I need you to fix it," he continued. Softer now, almost pleading. "You can install whatever modification you think will work. Just let me file it under my clearance. Make it look like we caught it in time." Beth met his eyes. "You want me to solve the failure, but not show that I was ever part of the solution." Jonas gave a weak shrug. "It's not personal. It's optics. Your name complicates things right now. Let me handle the paperwork and we keep this place running." Beth's hands were already resting on the edge of her workbench. She didn't raise her voice. "It goes in my way, or not at all." Jonas looked at her like someone trying to hold a conversation, through a locked door. Then he ran a hand down his face, muttered something under his breath, and left the way he came. He didn't slam the door this time. The call came at 05:30 hours on Thursday morning. Beth was already awake, had been since 0400, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The phone's harsh ring cut through the pre-dawn quiet like a blade. "We need you in now." Jonas's voice was tight, controlled. Panic barely held in check. "Emergency maintenance protocol. The Bradley's down." Beth was dressed and driving through the base gates within 15 minutes. The morning air was still cool, but she could already feel the heat building, pressing down like a preview of the scorching day ahead. The garage was blazing with emergency lighting when she arrived. The Bradley sat in the center bay like a wounded animal, its hull surrounded by diagnostic equipment and frustrated technicians. Ray paced near the main console, his usual swagger, replaced by something closer to desperation. "What happened?" Beth asked Marcus as she pulled on her coveralls. "Training run went bad," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "Full combat load, steep incline maneuver. The torque lag hit right at the worst possible moment." Beth felt her stomach tighten. "Anyone hurt?" "Rodriguez has a concussion from when his helmet hit the bulkhead. 2 others have whiplash. Could have been worse if they'd been going full speed." Ray's voice cut across the garage like a whip crack. "Where the hell is that systems analysis? I want to know what failed, and I want to know now." Danny looked up from his diagnostic tablet, face flushed with stress and frustration. "The R6 patch is working perfectly, sir. All parameters are within normal limits. The system says everything's fine." "Well, the system is wrong," Ray snapped. 3 of my people are in medical because your perfectly working system decided to hiccup at exactly the wrong moment." Beth watched the scene unfold with the detached clarity of someone who'd seen this movie before, the frantic rechecking of systems that were never broken in the first place, the desperate search for a software solution to a hardware problem, the growing panic as deadlines approached and answers remained elusive. Tanner appeared in the garage entrance like a storm cloud on the horizon. He didn't announce himself, didn't make a grand entrance. He simply materialized, tablet in hand, and the room's energy shifted immediately. "Status report," he said, voice calm but carrying absolute authority. Jonas hurried over, clipboard trembling slightly in his hands. "Sir, we're running comprehensive diagnostics. The R6 patch shows all systems nominal, but we experienced some Unexpected performance variations during the training exercise. Performance variations, Tanner repeated flatly. That's what we're calling it when a 30-ton vehicle nearly rolls over with 6 soldiers inside? The silence that followed was deafening. Tanner walked to the diagnostic station and plugged in his key drive. The main display lit up with data streams Beth recognized: torque curves, lateral response graphs, system timing logs. Everything. She'd been tracking for weeks, all the patterns she'd identified and documented and tried to warn them about. "The failure signature is clear," Tanner said, his voice carrying to every corner of the garage. Torque sync instability under dynamic load conditions. The R6 patch masks the symptoms but doesn't address the underlying mechanical issue. Every time you run this vehicle under stress, you're rolling dice with your soldiers' lives. Ray's face had gone pale. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this Bradley is grounded effective immediately. No training runs, no deployment, nothing until the root cause is identified and corrected." "We can't ground the unit 2 days before deployment," Ray protested. "Command will have my head." "Command will have more than your head if this vehicle fails in the field with a full squad aboard," Tanner replied coldly. "You want to explain to 6 families why their sons and daughters aren't coming home because you ignored a known mechanical fault?" The weight of that statement settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Beth could see it in everyone's faces. The sudden realization of what they'd been risking, what they'd almost lost. Jonas cleared his throat desperately. "Sir, if we could just run a few more diagnostic cycles, maybe adjust the R6 parameters." "The R6 isn't the problem," Tanner cut him off. "It's a Band-Aid on a severed artery. You need a real fix, not another software patch." His eyes found Beth across the room. "Unless someone here has a better idea." All eyes turned to her. Beth felt the familiar weight of attention, the sudden focus of people who'd spent weeks ignoring her and were now looking for salvation. She could see it in their faces. Hope mixed with desperation, the sudden willingness to listen to anyone who might have answers. But she also saw something else. In Ray's expression, she caught a flicker of recognition, the dawning awareness that the person he'd dismissed as support staff might be the only one who could save his career and his soldiers' lives. "I might," Beth said quietly. The room held its breath. "I might have something that could work." Tanner nodded slowly. "Show me." Beth walked to her workstation, acutely aware of every eye following her movement. She opened her personal toolkit and carefully lifted out the override module she'd built in secret weeks ago. It sat in her hands like a promise, like vindication, like the answer to a question nobody had wanted to ask. "It's a mechanical override for the torque sync pathway," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "It bypasses the software entirely, provides direct stabilization under dynamic load conditions." Danny scoffed, but it sounded hollow, desperate. "Homebrew modifications aren't authorized." "Neither is getting soldiers killed," Tanner said, sharply. He looked at Beth's device with the attention of someone who understood exactly what he was seeing. "How long to install?" 2 hours, Beth said. "Maybe 3 if we run full diagnostics afterward." Ray stepped forward, his earlier arrogance replaced by something that looked almost like humility. "Will it work?" Beth met his eyes. "It'll work." The garage erupted in activity as they prepared for the installation, but beneath the sudden urgency, Beth felt something else. A quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with being right and everything to do with finally being heard. The breaking point hadn't been when they ignored her warnings or dismissed her expertise. It had been when she realized that her silence was putting lives at risk. Now, with her hands steady and her purpose clear, she was ready to fight back, not with anger or vindication, but with the one thing that had always spoken louder than words: work that mattered, done right, when it counted most. Within the hour, the Bradley was positioned in the main bay, angled beneath the overhead work. Lights. The gantry arms had been raised, wheels chocked, and rear panels unlatched for access. Beth worked without commentary, her movements precise and purposeful. She pulled her torque meter from its foam-lined case, calibrating it by touch, a ritual that grounded her, connected her to the work ahead. The override module fit perfectly into the bracket she'd fabricated, every bolt and valve aligned exactly as she'd envisioned during those long nights of secret preparation. Marcus positioned himself nearby, ostensibly organizing tools but actually watching her work with fascination. He'd never seen anyone move with such quiet confidence, such complete mastery of their craft. "How long have you been building this?" he asked quietly. "Long enough," Beth replied, adjusting a tension spring with microscopic precision. "Some problems don't wait for permission to be solved." Danny appeared at her shoulder, his earlier skepticism now mixed with nervous curiosity. "You sure this thing won't interfere with the R6 protocols?" Beth didn't look up from her work. "The R6 will function normally. This just gives it something real to work with instead of phantom signals." Tanner observed from the diagnostic station, his tablet, displaying real-time system readings as Beth made each connection. His expression revealed nothing, but his attention was absolute, the focus of someone who understood that lives might depend on the precision of each adjustment. Ray paced the perimeter like a caged animal, occasionally pausing to glance at the wall clock. Every minute that passed was another minute closer to the deployment deadline, another tick toward potential disaster. "Talk to me," he said finally. "What exactly are you doing?" Beth straightened, wiping her hands on a clean rag. "The torque sync manifold controls how power transfers between the drive systems during lateral maneuvers. When you're climbing an incline and need to adjust course, the system has to balance traction, steering response, and stability in real time." She gestured to the Bradley's undercarriage. "The R6 tries to do this through software, predicting what the mechanical systems need based on sensor data. But sensors can lag, especially under dynamic conditions. By the time the software realizes there's a problem, physics has already taken over." "And your fix?" "Mechanical bypass. Direct physical response to torque variations, no processing delay. The system feels the stress and compensates instantly before the instability can cascade." Tanner looked up from his tablet. "Show me the test data." Beth nodded to Marcus, who wheeled over a portable diagnostic unit. She connected her override module to the test rig, then powered up the system. The display showed clean, steady curves, torque response that remained stable even as she manually introduced stress variations. "Baseline R6 response," she said, switching to a comparison view. The R6 data showed the telltale spikes and corrections they'd all been seeing for weeks, manageable in ideal conditions, potentially catastrophic under stress. Now with the override engaged, the curves smoothed immediately, the chaotic spikes replaced by controlled adjustments that tracked the input stress without amplification or delay. Ray stared at the display. "It actually works." "It works," Beth confirmed. "The question is whether you trust it enough to use it." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Everyone in the garage understood what was being asked. They could stick with the known quantity, a system that was failing but familiar, or trust their mission to a device built in secret by someone they'd spent weeks dismissing. Tanner broke the silence. "We run a controlled test, limited parameters, full monitoring, ready to abort at the first sign of instability." Ray nodded reluctantly. "How long?" "Give me 30 minutes to finish the installation," Beth said. "Then, we find out if theory matches reality." As she returned to work, Beth felt the subtle shift in the room's dynamics. People weren't ignoring her anymore, weren't looking through her like she was part of the machinery. Marcus handed her tools without being asked. Danny stopped making skeptical comments. Even Jonas, who'd spent weeks managing around her, now watched her work with something approaching respect. But it was Tanner's quiet confidence that meant the most. He'd seen her original design documents, understood the engineering behind her solution. When he looked at her work, he saw competence, not luck or desperation. "The Pentagon has been tracking this issue across multiple bases," he said, quietly as she made the final connections. "Your original fix could have prevented a lot of problems if anyone had listened." Beth's hands never paused in their work. "They're listening now." Some of them. Others will fight it because admitting you were right means acknowledging they were wrong. That's a harder problem to solve than torque instability. One problem at a time, Beth said, tightening the last bolt. First we prove it works, then we deal with the politics. She stepped back from the Bradley, her work complete. The override module was invisible now, integrated seamlessly into the vehicle's systems. To casual observation, nothing had changed. But Beth knew better. Everything had changed. "Systems ready for testing," she announced. Ray approached the vehicle like a man walking to his own judgment. His career, his soldiers' lives, his unit's deployment, all of it now depended on a device built by someone he'd spent weeks treating as invisible. "If this doesn't work," he began. "It'll work," Beth said with quiet certainty. "The question is, what happens when it does?" As they prepared for the test run, Beth felt a familiar calm settle over her. This was the moment she'd been preparing for, not just in the weeks since she'd started building the override, but in all the years since she'd first learned that being right wasn't enough. You had to be right at the right time, in the right way, with the right people willing to listen. Today, finally, all the pieces were aligned. The work was solid, the need was undeniable, and the consequences of failure were too serious for politics or pride to override practical necessity. The fight back had begun, not with confrontation or demands, but with patient competence and unshakable confidence in the value of work done right. Now it was time to prove that quiet strength could move mountains, or at least 30 tons of military hardware. The Bradley rolled out of the garage at exactly 1400 hours, its engine purring with a smoothness that hadn't been there before. Beth stood in the bay doorway, watching the vehicle disappear around the corner toward the test course, her heart hammering against her ribs despite her outward calm. Marcus joined her, wiping nervous sweat from his palms. "Think it'll work?" "I know it'll work," Beth said. "The question is whether they'll admit it." The test course was a quarter-mile loop with graduated inclines designed to simulate combat. Conditions: Ray would take the Bradley through a series of increasingly challenging maneuvers, while Tanner monitored every system from the mobile command unit parked at the course perimeter. Danny remained in the garage, ostensibly monitoring. Backup diagnostics, but actually pacing like a man waiting for his execution. Jonas sat at his desk, filling out paperwork with the desperate focus of someone trying to appear busy while his world shifted beneath his feet. The radio crackled to life. "Beginning run 1. Standard approach, 15-degree incline, combat load simulation." Through the garage windows they could see the Bradley climbing the first slope. It moved with mechanical confidence, its treads gripping the packed earth without hesitation. The lateral corrections that should have caused instability were smooth, controlled, nearly invisible. "Systems nominal," Ray's voice came through the speaker. "No lag, no drift. Proceeding to run 2. The second test was more aggressive. A steeper climb followed by a sharp directional change that would have triggered the torque sync failure under the old configuration. Beth held her breath as the Bradley approached the critical moment. The turn was flawless, no hesitation, no overcorrection, no dangerous lateral shift. The vehicle flowed through the maneuver like it was designed for exactly this kind of stress. "Incredible!" Tanner's voice came through clearly. "Torque response is rock stable. No anomalies detected." By the fourth test run, even Danny had stopped, pretending to work, and was listening to the radio with undisguised amazement. The Bradley was performing beyond specification, handling stress loads that would have crippled it just hours earlier. "Final run," Ray announced. "Full combat simulation. Maximum grade, emergency directional change, sustained lateral stress." This was the test that would have destroyed the old configuration, the scenario that had put Rodriguez in medical with a concussion. Beth closed her eyes and listened to the engine sound filtering through the radio. Smooth, steady, confident. "Jesus!" Ray's voice was barely controlled. "This thing handles like it's on rails. Zero instability, zero drift. Whatever you did, it's working perfectly." The cheers that erupted in the garage were spontaneous and genuine. Marcus slapped Beth on the back, grinning like a lottery winner. Even Jonas cracked a smile, relief flooding his features as he realized. His unit wouldn't be grounded after all. but Beth wasn't celebrating yet. She'd been through this before, the moment when success seemed assured, when people started taking credit and making plans. The real test wasn't whether her fix worked, it was whether she'd be allowed to own it. The Bradley returned to the garage 20 minutes later, followed by Tanner's command vehicle and a convoy of officers Beth didn't recognize. Word had spread through the base with the speed of wildfire. The grounded unit was operational again, the deployment was back on schedule, and there was a solution to a problem that had been plaguing multiple bases. Colonel Patricia Hayes stepped out of the lead vehicle, her insignia gleaming in the afternoon sun. She was followed by 2 Pentagon liaisons, a logistics coordinator, and enough brass to stock a military museum. Ray jumped out of the Bradley like a man reprieved from death row. "Colonel, the system performed flawlessly. 0 anomalies. Perfect. Stability under maximum stress conditions." "Outstanding work, Lieutenant Commander," Colonel Hayes replied. "I understand Supervisor Webb's team developed an innovative solution under very tight time constraints." Beth felt the familiar chill of recognition. The story was already being rewritten, the credit already being redistributed. Jonas stepped forward with his clipboard, ready to accept congratulations for work he'd actively tried to prevent. But Tanner wasn't playing that game. "Actually, Colonel, the solution was developed by Specialist Elizabeth Morrison," he said clearly, his voice carrying to every corner of the garage. "She identified the root cause, designed the fix, and implemented it despite significant resistance from the maintenance chain of command." The silence that followed was profound. Colonel Hayes looked from Tanner to Jonas to Beth, her expression shifting as she processed the implications of what she'd just heard. "Specialist Morrison," she said finally, "step forward." Beth approached slowly, acutely aware of every eye in the garage. This was the moment she'd been both anticipating and dreading, the point where quiet competence met official recognition, where years of being invisible suddenly reversed into uncomfortable visibility. "I understand you've solved a problem that's been affecting multiple installations," Colonel Hayes said. "Tell me about your solution." Beth glanced at Jonas, who was staring at his clipboard like it might spontaneously combust. Danny had found something fascinating to study on the far wall. Only Marcus met her eyes, giving her an encouraging nod. "The Bradley's torque sink manifold has an inherent instability under dynamic load conditions," Beth began, her voice steady. "Despite the stakes, the R6 firmware masks the symptoms but doesn't address the mechanical root cause. I designed a direct mechanical override that provides real-time torque stabilization without processing delays." Colonel Hayes studied her intently. "And this solution is based on what analysis?" "Original design specifications from the Bradley development program," Beth replied. "I worked on the suspension systems during the prototype phase before transitioning to military service." The Pentagon liaisons exchanged glances. One of them, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, stepped forward. "Specialist Morrison, are you saying you were involved in the original Bradley engineering project?" "I was part of the civilian contractor team, yes, sir, before the patent disputes and NDAs restructured the program." Another silence, this one charged with implications that went far beyond a single vehicle repair. Colonel Hayes looked at Tanner, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Supervisor Webb," the colonel said, turning to Jonas. "How long has Specialist Morrison been flagging this issue?" Jonas's face went through several color changes before settling on pale gray. "She mentioned some concerns during routine maintenance cycles." "Concerns that were addressed how?" "We were following standard diagnostic protocols, implementing R6 patches as recommended, while ignoring input from someone with direct knowledge of the system's original design." Colonel Hayes's voice carried the kind of quiet authority that made grown men reconsider their life choices. Ray, who'd been basking in the glow of successful testing just minutes earlier, now looked like he was calculating the distance to the nearest exit. Danny had apparently discovered that the far wall was the most interesting thing he'd ever seen. "Ma'am," Beth said quietly, "the important thing is that the fix works. The Bradley is operational, the deployment can proceed on schedule, and the soldiers are safe." Colonel Hayes studied her with sharp eyes. That's very generous of you, Specialist, but I'm less interested in being diplomatic than I am in understanding how we nearly deployed a unit with a known mechanical fault.
Tanner stepped forward, tablet in hand. Colonel, if I may, this isn't isolated to this base. We've documented similar failures at Fort Carson, Fort Stewart, and 2 overseas installations. The pattern is consistent. Torque sink instability.
Masked by software patches with maintenance teams unaware of the underlying mechanical issue. And Specialist Morrison's solution could be retrofitted across the entire Bradley fleet. It's elegant, cost-effective, and addresses the root cause instead of managing symptoms. The implications hung in the air like a storm cloud. Beth could see the calculations happening behind various sets of eyes. Career impacts, budget implications, the political fallout of admitting that a dismissed specialist had solved a fleet-wide problem that the official channels had missed. Colonel Hayes made her decision with the decisive clarity of someone accustomed to cutting through bureaucratic noise. Specialist Morrison, I'm authorizing immediate field testing of your modification. If the results confirm today's performance, we'll begin fleet-wide implementation. She turned to face the assembled group. I'm also ordering a full review of maintenance protocols at every installation where this issue has been documented. Someone explained to me how a specialist with original design knowledge was dismissed while we threw software patches at a hardware problem. Jonas looked like he was about to be sick. Danny had apparently become one with the wall. Ray opened his mouth, then thought better of whatever he'd been about to say. Furthermore, Colonel Hayes continued, Specialist Morrison will be transferred to the Pentagon Engineering Liaison Program, effective immediately. We need people who understand these systems at the policy level, not just the maintenance level. Beth felt the world tilt slightly. Ma'am, It's not a request, Specialist. It's recognition of expertise where it's needed most.
The Colonel's expression softened just slightly. Unless you have objections to leaving Dusktown behind. Beth glanced around the garage, at Marcus, who was grinning like his mentor had just won the lottery, at the Bradley that now hummed
with mechanical perfection, at Jonas and Danny, who were facing the consequences of their dismissive attitude, at the workbench where she'd spent 5 years proving herself one bolt at a time. No objections, ma'am, she said, as the official convoy prepared to leave, taking Beth with them for immediate briefings and paperwork. Marcus approached her workstation. She was packing her personal toolkit, the same case she'd brought to Dusktown 5 years earlier when she'd stepped off the bus with nothing but expertise and determination. You're really leaving? He asked. Looks that way. Beth closed the case with a satisfying click. You'll be fine here. Better than fine. You listen, you learn, and you're not afraid to ask questions when something doesn't make sense. What? About them? Marcus nodded toward Jonas and Danny, who were having what appeared to be a very uncomfortable conversation with Tanner. Beth shouldered her toolkit. They'll figure it out, or they won't. Either way, it's not my problem anymore. As she walked toward the garage doors, Beth felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The satisfaction of being valued for exactly what she was. Not dismissed, not tolerated, not worked around, but recognized and promoted specifically because of her expertise. The Bradley sat in its bay, no longer a source of frustration, but a testament to what happened when competence met opportunity at exactly the right moment. The torque sink manifold hummed with mechanical perfection, its instability corrected, by someone who'd understood the problem from the beginning and had waited patiently for the moment when her solution would finally be heard. The downfall hadn't come through confrontation or demands. It had come through the simple, undeniable reality of superior performance when it mattered most. Sometimes the best revenge was just being undeniably, unignorably right. 6 weeks later, Beth sat in a Pentagon conference room that was larger than the entire Dusktown maintenance bay. The walls were lined with displays showing Bradley performance data from installations across 3 continents, each screen telling the same story. Her mechanical override had eliminated torque sink failures wherever it had been implemented. Around the polished conference table sat the kind of people she'd only seen in briefing documents before: generals, defense contractors, Pentagon liaisons, and the Secretary of Defense himself. At the head of the table, Colonel Hayes presided over what had become known internally as the Morrison Protocol Implementation Review. Ladies and gentlemen, Colonel Hayes began, we're here to discuss the most significant improvement in Bradley. Performance since the platform's original deployment. Specialist Morrison, would you summarize the current status? Beth stood, still wearing her service uniform, but now carrying the confidence of someone whose expertise had been validated at the highest levels.
As of this morning, the mechanical override has been installed on 847 Bradley vehicles across 23 installations. 0 torque sync failures have been reported in any vehicle equipped with the modification. General Richardson, a man whose chest carried enough ribbons to stock a craft store, leaned forward. 0 failures in 6 weeks of intensive field testing. That's correct, sir. The mechanical solution provides real-time stability correction without the processing delays inherent in software-based approaches. And the cost analysis? This from Sandra Chen, the Pentagon's chief procurement officer. Installation cost per vehicle is approximately $340 in parts and labor. Compare that to the estimated $2.3 million cost of a single Bradley loss due to rollover, plus the incalculable cost in terms of crew safety and mission effectiveness. The numbers spoke for themselves, but Beth could see the political calculations happening behind various sets of eyes. Admitting that a dismissed specialist had solved a fleet-wide problem meant acknowledging that the normal channels had failed spectacularly.
That's when Jonas Webb entered the conference room. Beth hadn't seen him since leaving Dusktown, but he looked exactly as she remembered. Clipboard in hand, nervous energy barely contained, that particular brand of middle management desperation that came from being caught between incompetence above and competence below. "Ah, Supervisor Webb," Colonel Hayes said with the kind of tone that suggested unpleasant conversations were about to occur. "Thank you for joining us. Please, have a seat." Jonas sat stiffly, glancing around the room like a man calculating his chances of survival. Danny Martinez sat beside him, having apparently discovered that walls in Pentagon conference rooms were just as fascinating as those in military garages. "Supervisor Webb," General Richardson began, "we've been reviewing the maintenance protocols at Dusktown Reserve Base, particularly regarding the handling of the torque sync instability issue. Can you explain why Specialist Morrison's expertise was not utilized when the problem first emerged?" Jonas cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "Sir, we were following standard diagnostic procedures, implementing recommended R6 firmware updates as directed by—" "That's not what I asked," General Richardson interrupted. "I asked why someone with direct knowledge of the Bradley's original design was dismissed when she identified the root cause of a critical safety issue." The silence that followed was profound. Beth watched Jonas struggle with an answer that wouldn't incriminate him further, while Danny apparently attempted to become invisible through force of will. "Sir," Jonas finally managed, "Specialist Morrison was— her recommendations weren't— we had procedures that nearly got soldiers killed," Colonel Hayes stated flatly. "Procedures that ignored expertise in favor of what? Hierarchy? Politics? Explain to me how following procedures was more important than fixing a life-threatening mechanical fault." Tanner, who'd been quietly taking notes throughout the meeting, looked up from his tablet. "If I may, Colonel, I've completed the investigation into maintenance protocols at all affected installations. The pattern is consistent, qualified personnel with relevant expertise being overlooked or dismissed, while management focuses on software solutions to hardware problems." He gestured to a display that showed incident reports from multiple bases. At Fort Carson, a former aerospace engineer identified the same torque instability 3 months ago. His report was filed under non-critical observations and never acted upon. At Fort Stewart, a mechanic with 15 years of Bradley experience flagged identical symptoms. She was told to stick to standard procedures and stop looking for problems that didn't exist. General Richardson's expression was growing darker by the minute. "Are you telling me this is systemic? That qualified personnel are being routinely ignored across multiple installations?" "Yes, sir. The Morrison case at Dusktown wasn't an isolated incident. It's representative of a broader failure in how we utilize expertise within the maintenance structure." Beth felt a strange mix of vindication and sadness. Vindication because her experience was finally being recognized as part of a larger problem. Sadness because it meant there were others like her, competent people being dismissed, ignored, or worked around by systems that prioritized process over results. Secretary of Defense James Patterson, who'd been silent throughout most of the meeting, finally spoke. "Supervisor Webb, I want a direct answer. When Specialist Morrison first identified this issue, what was your response?" Jonas's face went through several color changes. "Sir, there were concerns about her qualifications, her clearance, level, the appropriateness of her qualifications?" Patterson's voice was dangerously quiet. "She designed the original system. Her clearance level? She was cleared for the work she was doing. Appropriateness? 3 soldiers were injured because her inappropriate recommendations were ignored." He stood up, his presence filling the room. "Let me be very clear about something. The United States military succeeds because we find the best people and give them the tools they need to excel. We fail when we let bureaucracy, prejudice, or personal insecurity override competence." Patterson turned to face Jonas directly. "You and Corporal Martinez are hereby relieved of your maintenance supervisory duties effective immediately. You'll be transferred to administrative roles where your decision-making will be limited to supply requisitions and paperwork." Jonas went pale. Danny looked like he might faint. "Furthermore," Patterson continued, "we're implementing the Morrison Protocol not just as a mechanical fix, but as a management approach. Every installation will establish direct channels for technical expertise to reach decision-makers, regardless of rank or position. No more qualified recommendations disappearing into bureaucratic black holes." He looked at Beth. "Specialist Morrison, you're being promoted to Chief Technical Liaison for Bradley Systems Development. Your job will be identifying problems like this before they put soldiers at risk and ensuring that expertise gets heard when it matters." Beth felt the weight of recognition, not just for her technical skills, but for her experience navigating systems that didn't want to listen. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." "You already haven't," Patterson replied. "The question is whether we'll let you down again." As the meeting concluded and people began filing out, Jonas approached Beth with the desperate look of someone trying to salvage something from complete disaster. "Beth, Listen, I know things got complicated back there, but you have to understand the position I was in, the pressure from above, the protocols we had to follow." Beth looked at him, with the calm expression of someone who'd already moved past anger into something closer to pity. "Jonas, I understand exactly what position you were in. You were in the position of having to choose between doing what was easy and doing what was right. You chose easy. That's not fair. It's completely fair. You had information that could have prevented soldiers from being injured, and you chose to ignore it because listening would have been inconvenient." "That's not a protocol problem, Jonas. That's a character problem." She shouldered her briefcase and headed for the door. "But here's the good news. Now you get to spend the rest of your career filing supply forms, where the worst thing that can happen if you ignore someone is that they run out of paper clips." As Beth walked out of the Pentagon conference room and into her new role as Chief Technical Liaison, she reflected on the long journey from that first morning in Dusktown when Ray had dismissed her as support staff. The climax hadn't come through confrontation or dramatic gestures. It had come through the patient accumulation of competence, the steady demonstration of expertise, and the willingness to keep doing excellent work even when no one seemed to notice. Sometimes the best revenge was just being undeniably, unignorably, systematically right until the system had no choice but to change around you. 1 year later, Beth stood in the Dusktown Reserve Base garage for the first time since her transfer to the Pentagon. The space looked different, cleaner, more organized, buzzing with the kind of focused energy that came from people who knew their work mattered and their expertise was valued. Marcus had been promoted to lead diagnostic technician, his quiet competence finally recognized and rewarded. He approached Beth with a genuine smile, the nervousness of their early interactions replaced by the confidence of someone who'd found his place. "Chief Morrison," he said, still slightly amazed by her new rank. "How does it feel to be back?" "Different," Beth admitted, looking around the bay where she'd spent 5 years proving herself one bolt at a time. "Better different." The Bradley that had started it all sat in the center bay, now serving as a training platform for the new maintenance protocols. Its mechanical override system had become the template for fleet-wide implementation, and the vehicle itself had been designated as a permanent teaching tool. "How many installations are running the Morrison protocol now?" Marcus asked. 43 and counting. "We're seeing a 78% reduction in critical maintenance oversights and a 45% improvement in equipment readiness across all participating bases." Beth ran her hand along the Bradley's hull, remembering the long nights she'd spent diagnosing its problems, while everyone else looked for easier answers. "More importantly, we're seeing mechanics like you getting promoted based on competence rather than connections." Near the main workstation, a new addition caught Beth's attention. A wall-mounted display showing the Technical Excellence Recognition Board. Photos of mechanics, technicians, and specialists from across the base lined the board, along with descriptions of innovations, improvements, and problem-solving achievements. Her own photo was there, of course, but so were a dozen others, people whose expertise had previously gone unrecognized, whose recommendations had been dismissed, whose competence had been overlooked until the new protocols gave them channels to be heard. "That was Major Thompson's idea," Marcus explained, following her gaze. "She said if we're going to celebrate technical achievement, we need to make sure people know who's actually doing the work." Major Sarah Thompson was Jonas's replacement. A career maintenance officer who'd risen through the ranks by actually understanding the systems she supervised. Her first act had been implementing the Morrison Protocol's management structure. Her second had been establishing recognition systems that celebrated competence over compliance. "Where's the old crew?" Beth asked. Marcus's expression darkened slightly. "Jonas got transferred to supply management at Fort Leonard Wood. Spends his days counting inventory and filing requisition forms. Danny's doing the same thing at a different base. Word is they're both counting the days to retirement." "And Ray?" "Lieutenant Commander Hutchinson got reassigned to a desk job at Fort Leavenworth. Turns out dismissing expertise that could have saved lives doesn't look good on performance reviews, especially when that expertise gets validated at the Pentagon level." Beth felt a complex mix of emotions about the fates of her former colleagues. Not satisfaction, exactly. Their downfall had been more about consequences catching up with poor decisions than any deliberate revenge on her part. But there was a sense of justice in seeing that actions had results, that dismissing competence came with professional costs. "Any regrets?" Marcus asked. Beth considered the question carefully. "About speaking up? About building the fix? About not letting them bury my recommendations? No regrets about any of that." She paused, watching a group of new mechanics working on a diagnostic problem with the kind of methodical attention she remembered from her early days. "Maybe one regret. I wish I'd found a way to make my voice heard sooner. Might have prevented some of the problems we're still fixing." "You're making up for it now," Marcus said. "The Morrison Protocol has changed how technical expertise gets heard across the entire military maintenance structure. People like us actually get listened to now." As if to illustrate his point, a young specialist approached them with a diagnostic tablet in hand. "Excuse me, Chief Morrison. I'm Jennifer Walsh, hydraulic specialist. I've been tracking an anomaly in the power steering systems that might be related to the torque sink issues you solved. Could I get a few minutes to walk you through my analysis?" Beth smiled, remembering her younger self approaching senior mechanics with questions and observations, usually to be dismissed or ignored. "Of course, Specialist Walsh. Show me what you found." As Jennifer laid out her analysis, thorough, well-researched, and professionally presented, Beth recognized the same pattern she'd seen a year earlier. A competent technician identifying a real problem, gathering solid evidence, and presenting a potential solution. The difference was that now there was a system in place to listen. "This is excellent work," Beth said after reviewing Jennifer's data. "I want you to prepare a formal presentation for the next technical review board. We'll get this in front of the right people and see about implementing your recommendations." Jennifer's face lit up with the kind of excitement Beth remembered. From her own early career, the pure joy of having technical work taken seriously by people who understood its value. After Jennifer left to prepare her presentation, Marcus looked at Beth with something approaching awe. You know what the biggest change has been? It's not just that people listen now. It's that people like Jennifer know they can speak up in the first place. Before, most of us would have just fixed the problem quietly and hoped someone noticed. Now we know our expertise has value. Beth nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The Morrison Protocol wasn't just about mechanical systems. It was about creating space for competence to flourish, regardless of rank or position or the personal prejudices of supervisors. That's the real victory, she said, not just fixing. Won Bradley or getting promoted or seeing the people who dismissed us face consequences. It's building a system where the next person like us doesn't have to fight for 5 years to be heard. As they walked through the garage, Beth noticed the subtle signs of the cultural change that had taken place. Mechanics consulted with each other across rank lines. Specialists shared expertise without worrying about stepping on toes. Problems were addressed based on technical merit rather than hierarchical politics. The Morrison Protocol had become more than a management structure. It had become a philosophy that prioritized competence over compliance, expertise over authority, results over relationships. Chief Morrison? A voice called from across the garage. Beth turned to see Major Thompson approaching with a folder in hand and a smile on her face. Major Thompson, how's the new assignment treating you? Better than I expected. Turns out running a maintenance operation is a lot easier when you actually listen to the people doing the work. She handed Beth the folder. Quarterly performance. Report. Thought you'd want to see the numbers. Beth opened the folder and felt a surge of quiet pride. Equipment readiness was up 34%. Maintenance-related incidents were down 67%. Personnel satisfaction ratings had improved across every category. Most importantly, the number of technical recommendations being implemented rather than ignored had increased by over 200%. These are exceptional results, Beth said. They're your results, Major Thompson replied. The Morrison Protocol didn't just fix the Bradley torque issue. It fixed how we think about expertise and who gets heard when technical problems arise. As Beth prepared to leave Dusttown and return to her Pentagon duties, she took one last look around the garage that had been both her proving ground and her prison for 5 long years. The space looked the same, but felt completely different. Filled with the kind of productive energy that came from people who knew their work mattered and their voices would be heard. Marcus walked her to the parking area, both of them quiet, as they processed the magnitude of what had changed. Thank you, he said finally. Not just for the technical stuff, but for showing the rest of us that competence matters more than politics. That doing good work and speaking up for what's right eventually pays off. Beth smiled, feeling the satisfaction that came not from personal vindication, but from systemic change. Just remember, the Morrison Protocol only works if people like you keep using it. Keep asking questions, keep identifying problems, keep pushing for solutions, even when it's easier to stay quiet. We will, Marcus promised. You changed how this place works. We're not going to let it go back to the old way. As Beth drove away from Dusktown Reserve Base, she reflected on the journey from dismissed mechanic to Pentagon liaison, from ignored specialist to system-changing innovator. The victory hadn't come through confrontation or revenge, but through the patient accumulation of competence and the refusal to let bureaucracy override expertise. The Morrison Protocol was now being implemented across dozens of installations, changing how the military recognized and utilized technical knowledge. But more than that, it was changing the culture around competence, creating space for people like Jennifer Walsh to speak up, for people like Marcus to be heard, for expertise to flow upward instead of being filtered out by hierarchy. Beth had never wanted recognition or titles or Pentagon offices. She'd wanted to do work that mattered, to solve problems that needed solving, to use her expertise to keep soldiers safe and equipment functional. Now she had all of that, plus something even more valuable. The knowledge that her experience had created opportunities for others like her to be heard from the beginning, rather than having to fight for years to earn the right to speak. Sometimes
Justice wasn't about punishment or revenge. Sometimes it was about changing the system so that competence could flourish, expertise could be heard, and good work could be recognized before it took a crisis to make people listen. The road ahead stretched toward Washington, toward her Pentagon office, toward the ongoing work of expanding the Morrison Protocol to even more installations. But part of her would always remain in that Dusktown garage, in the quiet satisfaction of work done right when it mattered most, in the patient accumulation of expertise that eventually became undeniable.
2 years after the first Bradley override installation, Beth stood before a Senate Armed Services Committee hearing room, packed with military officials, defense contractors, and journalists. The hearing was titled, Technical Expertise in Military. Maintenance, Lessons from the Morrison Protocol. But everyone in the room understood it was really about something larger, how organizations learn to listen to competence, regardless of where it comes from. Chief Morrison, Senator Patricia Wells began, in your written testimony, you state that the Morrison Protocol has been implemented at 127 installations worldwide, with measurable improvements in both equipment readiness and personnel satisfaction. Can you elaborate on the broader implications of these changes? Beth looked out at the packed hearing room, still sometimes amazed to find herself at the center of policy discussions that would affect thousands of military personnel. Senator, the technical improvements are important. We've seen dramatic reductions in equipment failures and maintenance-related incidents, but the cultural change has been even more significant. She gestured to a display showing implementation statistics. We've documented over 1,400 instances where technical expertise that would previously have been dismissed or ignored has been incorporated into maintenance procedures. That's 1,400 potential problems solved before they became crises, 1,400 opportunities for competent personnel to contribute meaningfully to mission effectiveness. Senator David Rodriguez leaned forward. Chief Morrison, some critics have suggested that the Morrison Protocol undermines traditional military hierarchy by allowing lower-ranking personnel to bypass their immediate supervisors. How do you respond to that concern? Beth had fielded this question dozens of times, and her answer had been refined through experience. Senator, the Morrison Protocol doesn't bypass hierarchy. It creates informed hierarchy. When a supervisor makes decisions based on complete information from competent sources, regardless of rank, those decisions are better. When expertise flows upward efficiently, everyone benefits. She paused, remembering her own years of frustration. In the Dusktown garage, military hierarchy exists to ensure clear command structure and accountability. The Morrison Protocol strengthens that structure by ensuring decisions are based on the best available technical information, not just the most convenient or politically acceptable information. General Patricia Hayes, now serving as Joint Chiefs, liaison to the committee, nodded approvingly. If I may add, Senators, we've seen a 23% improvement in junior officer retention rates at installations implementing the Morrison Protocol. When competent people know their expertise will be heard and valued, they stay in service longer and contribute more effectively. The hearing continued for 3 hours, covering everything from implementation costs to training requirements to long-term sustainability, but the question that mattered most came from Senator Elizabeth Chen near the end of the session. Chief Morrison, if you could go back to that garage at Dusktown Reserve Base, knowing what you know now, what would you tell your younger self? Beth considered the question carefully. In the gallery, she could see Marcus, who'd flown in from his new assignment as Regional Maintenance Coordinator. Beside him sat Jennifer Walsh, now a warrant officer specializing in hydraulic systems analysis. Both of them represented the new generation of military technicians who'd grown up with the Morrison Protocol, who'd never had to fight for years just to be heard. I would tell her that competence is patient, Beth said finally. That doing excellent work consistently, even when no one seems to notice, creates a foundation that can't be ignored forever. I would tell her that speaking up for technical solutions, even when it's uncomfortable or politically inconvenient, is part of the job of being truly competent. She looked directly at the camera that would carry her words to military personnel around the world, but mostly I would tell her that she's not alone, that there are people like Marcus and Jennifer and thousands of others who understand that technical excellence isn't just about fixing machines, it's about creating systems where competence can flourish and expertise can be heard. After the hearing, Beth found herself in the Pentagon cafeteria with Marcus and Jennifer, the three of them sharing coffee and reflecting on how far they'd all come from that first morning when she'd identified the torque sync problem that no one wanted. To acknowledge, "Chief, can I ask you something?" Jennifer said. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd just stayed quiet? If you'd done your job, collected your paycheck, and let someone else worry about the Bradley problems?" Beth stirred her coffee thoughtfully. "I used to wonder about that. But I realized the question itself was wrong. Staying quiet wasn't really an option for me. When you have expertise that can prevent problems or save lives, using that expertise isn't a choice, it's a responsibility." Marcus nodded. "That's what you taught me. That competence isn't just about what you know, it's about having the courage to act on what you know, even when it's difficult." "Especially when it's difficult," Beth agreed. "Easy problems get solved by easy solutions. The problems that matter, the ones that put people at risk or hold back progress, those require people willing to speak up when it's uncomfortable, to keep pushing when it's easier to give up." As they prepared to leave, Jennifer pulled out her phone and showed them a message from a young mechanic at Fort Hood. She says she identified a potential issue with fuel line pressure regulation in the newer Bradley variants. Under the old system, she probably would have just done a workaround and hoped someone else noticed. Instead, she's preparing a formal technical assessment for the Regional Review Board. Beth smiled, recognizing the pattern she'd seen dozens of times since the Morrison Protocol implementation: competent people identifying real problems, gathering solid evidence, and having confidence that their expertise would be heard and valued. "That's the real legacy," she said, "not fixing one vehicle or getting promoted or even changing policy at the Pentagon level. It's creating a culture where people like her know that competence matters more than compliance, that technical excellence is valued over political convenience." 6 months later, Beth received an email that made her smile despite the early morning hour. It was from Specialist Rodriguez at Fort Carson, a hydraulics technician who'd identified and solved a recurring problem with power steering response in extreme cold weather conditions. His solution was being implemented fleet-wide, and his analysis had been cited as a model of thorough technical investigation. "Chief Morrison," his email read, "I wanted to thank you for creating the Morrison Protocol. I've been in the Army for 8 years, and this is the first time I've felt like my technical expertise was actually valued. I used to just fix problems quietly and hope someone noticed. Now I know that if I do good work and speak up professionally, people will listen. That's changed everything for me." Beth forwarded the email to Marcus and Jennifer, along with a dozen similar messages she'd received from technicians, mechanics, and specialists across multiple branches of service. Each one told a variation of the same story: competent people who'd found their voice, technical problems solved before they became crises, expertise flowing upward instead of being filtered out by bureaucracy. Later that morning, as Beth reviewed implementation reports from the latest batch of installations adopting the Morrison Protocol, her assistant knocked on her office door. "Chief Morrison, there's someone here to see you. Says it's about a technical consultation." Beth looked up to see a young woman in Army coveralls, nervously clutching a folder and looking around the Pentagon office like she couldn't quite believe she was there. "I'm Specialist Amanda Taylor," she said. "I'm stationed at Fort Bragg, and I've been tracking what I think might be a systematic issue with transmission cooling in the newer Stryker variants. My supervisor said I should bring it directly to you." Beth smiled, recognizing herself from years earlier. The nervous competence, the careful documentation, the hope that expertise would be heard and valued. "Please, Specialist Taylor, have a seat. Tell me what you found." As Amanda laid out her analysis with the kind of thorough professionalism that Beth remembered from her own early career, she felt the deep satisfaction that came not from personal achievement but from systemic change. The Morrison Protocol had created space for people like Amanda to be heard from the beginning, rather than having to fight for years to earn the right to speak. "This is excellent work," Beth said after reviewing Amanda's documentation. "I want you to present this to the full Technical Review Board next week. We'll get the right engineers involved and see about implementing your recommendations across the affected vehicle classes." Amanda's face lit up with the same excitement Beth remembered from her first moments of being truly heard, truly valued for her technical expertise, rather than dismissed or worked around. After Amanda left to prepare
her presentation, Beth stood at her Pentagon office window, looking out at the city beyond. Somewhere out there, in garages and maintenance bays and repair facilities around the world, competent people were doing excellent work, identifying problems, developing solutions, and speaking up with the confidence that their expertise mattered. Some of them were solving problems that would save lives. Others were preventing equipment failures that could compromise missions. All of them were part of a culture that valued competence over compliance, expertise over hierarchy, results over relationships. Beth had never been after recognition or titles or corner offices. She'd wanted to do work that mattered, to solve problems that needed solving, to use her expertise to make things better. Now she had all of that, plus something even more valuable, the knowledge that her experience had created opportunities for countless others to be heard, valued, and empowered to make meaningful contributions. The Morrison Protocol was more than a management structure or a policy framework. It had become a philosophy that competence could flourish anywhere, that expertise deserved respect regardless of its source, and that the best solutions often came from the people closest to the actual work. Beth had started as just a mechanic, dismissed and overlooked in a garage at Dusktown Reserve Base. But she'd proven that being just a mechanic, or just a technician, or just a specialist, was never a limitation. It was an opportunity to understand systems deeply, to identify problems clearly, and to develop solutions that actually worked. Her legacy wasn't the Bradley Torque Sync Fix or the Pentagon position or the policy changes that bore her name. Her legacy was the thousands of competent people who now knew their expertise had value, their voices would be heard, and their work could change everything. Sometimes the most powerful victories were the quiet ones, the patient accumulation of competence that eventually became undeniable, the steady demonstration of expertise that changed systems from within. The refusal to let bureaucracy override the fundamental truth that good work, done right, always mattered most. In the end, Beth Morrison had never stopped being just a mechanic. She'd simply proven that mechanics, and all the other competent people doing essential work, deserved to be heard when they had something important to say. And now, finally, they were. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.